Hello, my name is Shawn Briscoe, and in this presentation I'm going to take a look at the roles and responsibilities of each of the speakers over the course of a policy debate round. I'm going to reference these visual slides a few times to help illustrate what I'm talking about, and once again I need to give a shout out to my old boss, Stephen Johnson, the Director of Debate at the University of Alaska Anchorage, who created these visuals of a debate on banning tobacco to help understand how judges view debates. And you can actually read more about that and examine those more if you check out his book, Winning Debates by Stephen Johnson. But at any rate, we could have an imaginary debate topic in which the United States federal government should ban tobacco products. And you can imagine that that resolution creates a playing field for the debate where we'll have arguments from the pro side and arguments from the con side, and we'll have clash back and forth. The first two speeches in a policy debate round, the first affirmative constructive and the first negative constructive, are laying the foundation of the debate. What do I mean by that? Well, those two speakers are going to identify the offensive arguments that support their side of the debate topic. So you can imagine on that debate topic about banning tobacco that we might have three separate offensive arguments. The first affirmative constructive is probably going to come in and primarily develop arguments about public health, about how using tobacco products, whether it be smokeless tobacco or cigarettes, cigars, you name it, it's going to harm people's lives. It's going to disrupt their health, potentially lead to death, and so forth. The negative might come in with two offensive arguments, two disadvantages. One, dealing with the economic consequences of banning tobacco products, and a second related to taking away individuals' rights. And so we have three big arguments in this debate round, and the 1AC and the 1NC are going to lay the foundation of those arguments. Okay, so let's look specifically at the first affirmative constructive. The purpose of the 1AC is to introduce us all to the debate round and start the round off in the affirmative's favor. The 1AC is not tasked with winning the debate, okay? The 1AC is merely there to introduce us to the topic, to help us understand the main arguments that support the affirmative side of the resolution. They're going to give us a plan text, they're going to give us a problem, they're going to give us a solution. That's what the 1AC is going to do. They're going to lay out that case by demonstrating each of the 5 stock issues. At the end of that speech, the judge should have absolutely no reason to vote negative. And what I mean by that is, you want to answer each of those stock issues so that you tell enough of a story that the judge can go, okay, that seems like a pretty decent idea. Some hints for the 1AC. The 1AC should be a pre-written speech. Most debate tournaments, policy debate rounds are 8 minutes long. If you're participating in the St. Louis Urban Debate League's middle school program, your 1AC is only 4 minutes long. But at any rate, that speech is a pre-written speech. You should be able to recite the first affirmative constructive mostly from memory. Okay, I don't usually tell my students that they have to have the 1AC memorized for the first tournament of the year, but by the time we get to the midway point of the season, and especially as we near the end of the season, you should have read that speech so many times that you can recite it from memory. So you should be able to look up at the judge from time to time, especially if you have a lay judge. You should be able to engage and read feedback from your audience as you're delivering your speech so that you can adjust things accordingly. You also want to make sure that you know your case really, really well. You want to know what the problem is, why that problem exists, how extensive it is, what your plan is going to do about that problem, why it's going to work, how it's going to be effective. You want to know everything about your case so that when your opponents get up in cross-examination to ask you questions, you can answer them. You can go beyond what's in the 1AC to explain the backstory, to fill in details as the negative team is asking you questions about your case. The first negative constructive is primarily concerned with casting doubt on the worth of the resolution. Like the 1AC, The 1NC does not have to win the debate round. The 1NC is simply presenting some offensive arguments to make the judge go, maybe the affirmative isn't such a great idea after all. In addition to presenting those offensive arguments, the 1NC is going to want to raise some questions about the 1AC specifically to address how large the problem is or how effective the plan is going to be at solving the problem. But primarily speaking, the 1NC is going to want to focus on those offensive arguments, the reasons to actually reject the affirmative, not just question the affirmative. In terms of prep time, the first negative constructive, I would say, wants to shoot for using only 30 seconds of prep time or so. And that's true whether or not you are at a tournament that gives 5 minutes of prep time, 10 minutes of prep time, or anything in between. You want to shoot for only using 30 seconds of prep time before your speech. That means that while the first affirmative constructive is being delivered, you need to be thinking ahead about what arguments you are going to run. Okay? If you have a separate folder of all of your offensive arguments, it makes it really easy to just have all of those sitting on your desk before the round has started and pull out the relevant offensive arguments so that you can pretty much stand up and just give your speech. What do you do during those 30, and then during the cross-examination period while your partner is asking questions of the 1AC, you can spend those 3 minutes looking through the affirmative case itself and pulling any pieces of evidence that you want to use to question the harm story or the solvency story of that case. And then during those 30 seconds of prep time, you're really just getting your flows in order, getting your notes in order, making sure that all of the things you want to read are in the order that you want to read them, so that when you give your speech, you are organized. Okay? All of the actual prepping should have been done already before you get to the prep time. You really are just using those 30 seconds to get yourself organized before you begin speaking. Okay, like I said, your primary job is to establish the negative strategy and therefore cast a little doubt upon the worth of the resolution and therefore the affirmative as well. Generally speaking then, you're going to spend about 6 minutes or 3/4 of your 1NC establishing the negative strategy by reading your off-case arguments, which would be your offensive arguments. Okay, those are, I like to think of the 1NC as a modular speech. You can't really go into a debate tournament with the 1NC completely written out for every single round the way you can with your affirmative case, but you can have a number of different offensive arguments, most of which will apply to just about every affirmative case that's topical. So then, when you're listening to the 1AC, you can identify the most applicable arguments, the most applicable offensive arguments for that particular case, and then be prepared to read those arguments. That means that you should have read the shells of those arguments a number of times in practice before you ever even get to the first tournament, so that you know exactly how long it takes you to read all of those arguments, so that you know how many you are going to be able to read in any given debate round. Okay, so like I said, it's not a pre-written speech, but it is modular in that you have several options which are available to you, and you can pull the ones that apply best for that specific round. I also put a note on this slide that says put out all of the negative positions in the 1NC. Back in the day, it was common for negative teams to save their counterplans or their disadvantages for the second negative constructive, rather than doing them in the 1NC. I think that's actually a poor strategy, and the reason is those are your offensive arguments. That's how you're actually going to win the round, and if you save those arguments for the 2NC, you do not have the time to provide the level of detail and development that the affirmative has done with the affirmative case, which makes it really, really hard for you to convince a judge that your offensive arguments are as strong or stronger than the affirmative case. In addition, the 1AR actually has a pretty easy job if you run new offensive arguments in the negative block, because all they have to do is find 2 critical weaknesses of the argument, and there is absolutely no way the second negative rebuttal is going to have time to answer those presses while also telling a convincing story. So you're best served by putting out your offensive arguments in the 1NC. You also want to spend a couple minutes mitigating the affirmative case, or reducing the level of harms and solvency that the affirmative can claim. Okay, so about a quarter of your speech time is going to be spent attacking the affirmative case specifically. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can read evidence, or you can point out logical inconsistencies or fallacies, gaps in the storytelling of the 1AC. You can use either of those methods for attacking the affirmative case. My preference as a debater when I was in college was that my partner simply read about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes worth of cards against the affirmative case, and then we saved the specific analytical responses for the 2NC. That was just my strategy. You can really do whatever you want to do. One of the things that I should also point out about the 1NC and the 1AC, since they are foundational speeches, they're creating the foundation which all of the arguments are going to be built upon later in the debate round. We really do rely very heavily on lengthy quotations, evidence, cards, whatever you want to call them. We use evidence about 99% of the time in the 1AC and the 1NC, meaning that almost everything you say in those two speeches is going to be a quote. Okay, and we do that, like I said, so that we can create a solid foundation, and later on in the debate we start incorporating our own analysis and our own logic and make comparisons and those types of things. Okay, so that brings us to the middle of the debate. So we had our first two speeches, and now we're going to look at the 2AC, 2NC, 1NR, and 1AR, or the second affirmative constructive, second negative constructive, first negative rebuttal, and first affirmative rebuttal. Those four speeches are going to construct arguments, deconstruct arguments, and rebuild arguments. That means you're going to continue to build upon the ideas that came out in the 1AC and 1NC. You're going to look at your opponent's arguments and try and tear them down, start to destroy those arguments, start to attack those arguments, start to question the validity of those arguments. But then since your opponents have been attacking your ideas, you also need to engage in some rebuilding of your ideas. This is what is known as clash in debate. You look at each of the individual issues in the debate and you have argument back and forth on those issues. And we start to see which of the debate teams is going to win each of those individual arguments. As you build them, make them larger, attack your opponents, and rebuild your case. So specifically, let's look at the second affirmative constructive. The purpose of the second affirmative constructive is to reestablish the affirmative case and enlarge it. Give the judge more reason to vote for you. Prep time, similar to the 1NC, you want to shoot for taking about 30 seconds of prep time. That might be a difficult task because you don't know what offensive arguments your opponents are going to run against you. That being said, there is a decent amount of predictability out there. One, we know the types of arguments which tend to be run on any given debate topic, and so you can start to think about the arguments that are generically being run against the topic. You also should be familiar enough with your own affirmative case that you know what arguments apply the most to it. So then, before you ever even go to the tournament, you can start to create what we call front lines. First line responses to any of those common arguments that your opponents might run against you. Then, as you hear them run, say, a spending disadvantage or a hegemony disadvantage or a politics disadvantage against you, you can pull out your front line that is a pre-written line of responses and have that in front of you, and all you really have to do then is decide which of the responses that you wrote in advance apply to this particular version of the argument that your opponents ran. That way you don't have to spend a lot of prep time before your speech. You can have your front line in front of you and make decisions, and if you're really good, you can actually, by really good I actually mean really experienced, you can actually pull out that front line, and as you're reading your 2AC, as you're delivering your 2AC, you can actually look through those front lines and select the ones that are most applicable. Then you have 3 minutes of prep time during your partner's cross-examination of the 1 in C, right? Your partner is going to spend 3 minutes asking questions of the 1 in C, so at that point, you can take any of the offensive arguments that your opponents ran, which you were not prepared for, and start thinking about how you would respond to those, and you can write those out on your flows or on your notes during that 3 minutes. And like the 1 in C, your prep time usage, your 30 seconds of prep time, is really to get yourself organized for your speech. Make sure that your notes are in the order you want them, that your flows are in the order you want them, and that the cards are in the order that you want to read them. You also need to make sure that you answer everything. Your opponents are going to read 1, 2, 3, 4 different offensive arguments against the affirmative case. That might mean they read a topicality argument saying that your plan is outside the topic area. They might read 2 disadvantages and a counterplan. That's 4 offensive arguments against the affirmative. If you drop any of those 4 arguments, and by drop I mean don't answer any of those 4 arguments, you are probably going to lose the debate round, right? So you have to answer all 4 of those arguments. In addition, the 1 in C, if she did her job properly, is going to have put some questions on the affirmative case. Read some cards saying that the harm story isn't true, or the solvency story isn't necessarily true, that it's less effective or whatever. You need to make sure that you answer those as well, so that the negative doesn't get away with saying, hey, you dropped your harms story, there's no problem for you to solve, and now all we have is a risk of some sort of offense that we've read with our off-case positions. So you need to make sure that you answer every single big argument or big issue in the debate. Thinking back to that clash slide that I showed earlier about we had public health, smokers' rights, and economics. If you didn't discuss the economics argument in the 2AC, that off-case argument that your opponents ran, you're probably hosed. You're probably going to lose that debate. So you need to make sure you answer everything. You also want to be the one to create the structure for the off-case arguments. Some debaters, some 2ACs will actually refer to the off-case or the structure of the disadvantage or the counterplan and say, off the link, I have a response here, or off the brink, I have 2 responses, and so forth. But I've actually found that the best way to keep things clear in the debate round is for the 2AC to simply look at, say, the politics disadvantage and just say, on the politics disadvantage, I have 6 responses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Put those arguments out, give them numbers 1 through 6, and then that becomes the structure that everyone will use in the debate to test the validity of the off-case arguments that your opponents ran. 4, make sure that you extend the affirmative case. By extend the affirmative case, I mean even if your opponents don't address a harm story or don't address your solvency story, make sure that you go back and say, extend observation 1, the harms of biodiversity loss. That goes uncontested in the 1 in C. You want to extend that because you don't want to give the judge an easy way out at the end of the debate round where they say, well, you're doing a pretty good job of winning all of the off-case arguments, but you forgot to extend the affirmative case, so I have no reason to vote for the affirmative team. Make sure you extend your case. Don't forget to extend your case. Say, extend observation 1. Even if you do as little as saying, extend observation 1, they dropped it. Right? You need to make sure that there is ink on the flow so that the judge knows that the case is still relevant in the debate. The rule of thumb for the second affirmative constructive is that about half the things you say should be quotations or cards or evidence, and about half the things you say should be analytical arguments, meaning your own analysis, your own use of logic in the debate, or comparing the cards that have been read by both teams. So 50% of the things you say are additional cards, 50% of the things are analytics. That's just a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it should be about 50-50. Generally speaking, that probably means that debaters are spending more than half the time reading cards, just because they tend to be a little bit meatier than the analytics, but they don't have to be. I mean, really good debaters at the highest levels will have really good logical analysis in the debate round, and it truly will be about 4 minutes on cards and 4 minutes on analytics. So that's the second affirmative constructive. Then we move into the negative block. The negative block is the second negative constructive and the first negative rebuttal. Again, if you have watched my previous presentations, we think of the negative block as a single 13-minute speech given by two different speakers, and there's a cross-examination period in between. Okay. The purpose of the negative block is to reestablish the negative positions, the off-case arguments that you have, and really develop them for the judge. The prep time, most of the prep time should come immediately before the second negative constructive. So if you are at a tournament that gives you 5 minutes of prep time, the 1NC should have taken 30 seconds. That leaves you 4.5 minutes of prep time. Ideally, the second negative constructive then is going to use about 4 minutes, maybe only 3.5 minutes. But the largest chunk of prep time is going to come right before the 2NC. And that gives you a lot of time to look at the affirmative responses in the 2AC and really ensure that they are answered. Make sure that you're developing your arguments and so forth. A couple of tricks. The 2NC can save herself a lot of time by pre-flowing the off-case positions of the 1NC so that you do not have to listen to the 6 minutes or so that your partner was reading disadvantages and topicality arguments, counterplans, critiques, whatever. If you already have those arguments pre-flowed before the round even starts, then you have your flow, your notes of your partner's speech down before she gives the speech. That enables you then, while your partner is delivering the speech, to be reaching into the extension files and identifying some of the stronger pieces of evidence that you plan to read in the negative block. So that's a way that you can save yourself some prep time. The 1NR, the first negative rebuttal, should never take prep time. The 1NR should never take prep time. Why? Because your partner took probably 4 minutes of prep time, so that was prep time for you as well. Your partner had an 8-minute speech, that's prep time for you. And then your opponents asked cross-examination questions for 3 minutes of your partner. That's 3 minutes more of prep time. The first negative rebuttalist has tons and tons of time to get ready for the speech, so you should not need any prep time whatsoever. One of the things that needs to happen then in the negative block is you're reestablishing the negative positions and ensuring that the judge understands where you're coming from. One of the things that may need to happen is that you may need to consolidate down to the key arguments being run by the negative team. If you ran 4 off-case arguments, for example, remember I gave the example of a topicality argument, 2 disadvantages, and a counterplan. You really ought to consolidate by identifying which of those 4 offensive arguments were either was the weakest or was best handled by the affirmative, meaning you don't have much of a chance of winning that argument. And you can actually kick out of that position in the negative block. And then that means you're down to now 3 big offensive arguments in the debate round. And that gives you more time then in that 13 minutes to ensure that you win those 3 arguments. I'm going to come back to this issue at the end of this slide, but out of those 3 big offensive arguments that you have left, and I would say that's true even if you're in a really fast round on the national circuit and say there were 6 offensive arguments in the 1NC, I would still say you want to kick out of 3 of those arguments in the negative block so that you're down to just 3. And out of those 3, you want to plan on winning 2 of them in the negative block. And that's just a rule of thumb. Like I said, I'll come back to that near the end of the slide. Okay. During this speech, or the 2 speeches, you want to develop the arguments further. So obviously your opponents during the 2AC have attacked your off-case arguments. So you need to, of course, develop your argument simply by rebuilding rebuilding from the damage that was done by the 2AC, filling in the gaps that they've pointed out or that they've created in the story. You need to fill all of that back in, but also make it larger. Make the link story stronger and more specific to the affirmative plan itself. Maybe you had a generic link in the 1NC, and so now you can read specific links to the plan that your opponents read. Maybe you had a generic impact story, and now you can read a specific impact scenario. Make the argument stronger so that it's more likely to be a winning position for you at the end of the round. then you will succeed in making the judge see your positions, truly understand what those arguments are and how they work. Similar to the second affirmative constructive, the negative block speeches, the 2 in C and the 1 in R, should be about 50-50 cards versus analytics. So half the things you say should be quotations and half the things you say should be analytical arguments. And again, that's a rule of thumb. But most importantly, you're beginning to formulate the second negative rebuttal story. You're making sure that you start to hint at what, or maybe explicitly identify what the second negative rebuttal story is going to be, so that the judge can actually start to envision why she wants to vote for you. Okay, divide and conquer in the negative block. There were several things that I said up above that relate to this divide and conquer concept. We think of the 2 in C and the 1 in R as a single speech given by two different people. That means that you should not repeat what your partner said if you're the first negative rebuttal. You do not want to just parrot your partner. You divide up the arguments so that you talk about two separate issues in the debate. Remember the example that I said you had topicality, two disads, and a counterplan. Maybe you've decided that the topicality argument doesn't apply. So now you have two disadvantages and a counterplan. The 2 in C might take the two disadvantages, and the 1 in R will take the counterplan. Okay, so that way, the 1 in R, taking the counterplan, doesn't have to listen to the 2 in C. You run no risk of repeating your partner. And then you get to spend all of your partner's speech time developing answers to the 2AC's responses to the counterplan, and filling in the gaps and making it a stronger counterplan, so that it becomes a winning issue for you in the debate round. Ideally, when you divide things up, my personal opinion, the strongest negative teams are the ones who say whatever position, whatever off-case position the 1 in R has taken is the argument that you want to win the debate with. You're hoping to win the round on that 1 in R's off-case position. And the reason is simple. Well, actually, there's a couple of reasons. One, the 1 in R had a ton of time to prep responses for that argument. So it should be really well thought out and really, really developed. Second, you spend 5 minutes, or maybe 4.5 minutes if you're also kicking out of an argument or two. You're spending 4 to 5 minutes of speech time really developing that argument. So not only did you have a lot of time to prep the argument, you also had a lot of speech time devoted to developing that position. And the third reason why it's a good idea to put your key winning position in the 1 in R is because the affirmative, the 1AR, has less time to prep for that argument. They have some prep time to use during cross-examination to answer the 2 in C arguments, and those are probably the things that speaker is mostly going to focus on. So save your critical argument, your key argument, for the 1 in R, and you're tactically in a pretty good position in the debate round. Now that leaves two other off-case arguments or offensive arguments for the 2 in C. And I would generally say that you want to win one of those positions. Ensure that you win one of those positions in the 2 in C. And that's your backup in case the 1AR destroys the 1 in R's argument, right? So that's your backup. The other off-case position is one that you want to put enough responses on that it could be the backup to the backup, but you don't necessarily have to win it then. You don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time thinking about responses on it, but you want to do enough work extending that position that it's something that the affirmative still has to deal with. And then ideally the 2 in C is also going to spend time extending the attacks against the affirmative case. Then that moves us into the first affirmative rebuttal. I think of this as the linchpin in the debate. This is where things are really going to get important, because the 1AR, or the things that the 1AR says, tends to be the hinge of whether or not the affirmative is going to win or lose the debate. Primarily that has to do with the fact that the 2AC put a diverse number of responses on each of the offensive arguments of your opponents, but then your opponents had 13 minutes to answer them, and you only have 5 minutes to respond to all of that. So it's a very difficult speech. You, therefore, will take most of the affirmative's prep time before the 1AR. Similar to what I said for the negative block. The affirmative, the 2AC, probably took 30 seconds of prep time, leaving you 4.5 minutes of prep at a 5-minute prep tournament. So take about 4 minutes of prep time so that the 2AR has 30 seconds, or maybe leave a minute for your partner. But you're going to take a lot of prep time before the 1AR to ensure that you have answered everything in the debate. Now, some ways that you can save some time: identify after the 2AC what your strongest responses are on each of the arguments. That way you can zero in on just those critical responses when you're prepping, and you don't have to worry about everything that your partner said. Also, during the 3-minute cross-examination while your partner is asking questions of the second negative constructive, make sure you spend all of those 3 minutes thinking about your responses to what the 2NC just said. And if you happen to go up against a 1 in R who decides to take some prep time, that is a huge gift for you as a 1AR. Use that prep time for yourself. And then, any prep time that you take, those 4 minutes of prep time or so that you're going to take before the 1 in R, or excuse me, before the 1AR, is really primarily aimed at addressing the issues which the 1 in R was extending. The organization of your speech. You always want to put the most dangerous arguments on the top. Whatever argument you think the negative is likely to win the debate round on, make that the first thing that you talk about in the 1AR so that you can ensure that you answer it and beat it. And then the least dangerous argument should be down on the bottom. Generally speaking, that probably means it's your affirmative case. The affirmative case is the last thing that you talk about, because you certainly can't lose with it, but you do need to make sure that you extend it. The exception to that is if you're pretty sure that your case is going to be the reason why you win the debate, it's absolutely outweighing everything that your opponents have said, then the affirmative case needs to be higher on that chain because it's the most advantageous to you, so therefore maybe it should be on top. No introductions for the 1AR. If you're on the national circuit or you have college debaters or former debaters judging you, you probably aren't using introductions before any of your speeches anyway. But I would say even if you're on a circuit where the judging pool is comprised almost exclusively of lay judges, and therefore you're incorporating introductions with your speeches, I would say that the 1AR does not have time to give introductions. So don't bother. Just jump straight into the argumentation. And again, the reason is your opponents just had 13 minutes to develop arguments. You only have 5 minutes to respond to that. So do not use an introduction before the 1AR. Make sure that you cover everything. Now, you don't have to talk about every single response that's been made in the debate round. You need to talk about each of the big issues in the debate. So if there's still a counterplan and 2 disadvantages, you make sure that you answer both of those disads and that counterplan. But within each argument, you only have to win one piece of the argument, because if you break one critical aspect of that argument, the whole thing is going to lose its relevance to the debate. So you save time by being smart and going, when I look back at the 2AC, what were the 2 or 3 best responses on those arguments? And just go after those responses to ensure that they beat the argument that your opponents have run. It should go without saying, but follow the 2AC structure. The 2AC created a structure. The example I used earlier was just that there were 6 responses. The 2AC numbered them 1 through 6. So you can just zero in and say, hey, the 2AC number 2 and the 2AC number 4 will beat this argument. Those are the 2 things I'm talking about on this particular issue. And then develop your responses and explain why those responses are the winning responses and in fact beat the argument that your opponents ran. The rule of thumb then is that you extend 2 to 4 responses per argument. If you are debating in front of lay judges, I would say absolutely only 2 responses. If your opponents are significantly faster than you, then I would say absolutely, meaning they speak really quickly, absolutely only 2 responses. If you are a faster team, you might be able to get away with 3 or 4 responses per big issue or per off-case argument. So the rule of thumb is 2 to 4. Make sure that you win those 2 to 4 responses, preferably only 2, honestly. And then absolutely no cards. By the time we get to the 1AR, there should not be any more evidence read in the debate round. Once we are done with the negative block, we are done reading quotations, we are done reading cards. Now everything left in the debate is about the debaters themselves and ensuring that you are using sound logic, that you're comparing the cards that the two teams read, and so forth. So do not read cards. And then also, in order to save yourself time, don't repeat yourself. If you have multiple responses in the debate round which are similar, do not repeat them over and over and over. You are just wasting your own speech time. Okay, so do not repeat yourself. Once the 1AR is over then, we're down to the last two speeches of the debate, the second negative rebuttal and the second affirmative rebuttal. I believe that most debates are actually won in these two speeches. Debates are lost in the first 6 speeches. You make a critical mistake and the game is over. But close debates are won in the final 2 speeches. And you do that by framing the debate or framing the issues in the debate, assigning context to the different arguments, assigning priorities to the different arguments that have been presented, and showing why the arguments which you and your partner ran are the most critical arguments and therefore the winning arguments in the debate. Okay, this is, again, going back to Steve Johnson's slides. You start to engage in vertical debate. Instead of having clash back and forth on each of the individual issues, which you will do some of that, but your primary concern in the 2NR and 2AR is the vertical debate, comparing issues against one another, making each individual issue more relevant or less relevant, depending on which ones we're talking about, so that it occupies more space in the judge's mind, has more relevance, has more meaning, is more impactful, so that you're likely to win the debate on that particular issue. And then you can create a situation like this one, in which we were, again, talking about banning tobacco when there were 3 issues: the affirmative case dealing with public health, and then the negative off-case arguments about economic consequences and rights, the freedom to choose to smoke. The negative team won their 2 off-case arguments, but the 2AR succeeded in showing that the public health argument is actually the most important argument and the one that should drive the judge's decision in the debate round. So what then do the 2NR and the 2AR actually look like? I think it's helpful if you look at those speeches as having 3 parts. The first part of the final rebuttal is simply an overview. It highlights why you win. And it could be as simple as a 10-second or a 5-second overview that says, we win 2 reasons. First, the disadvantage is going to outweigh any chance of solvency on the case. And second, you know that you have the counterplan, which is net beneficial and is going to win the debate, even if the disadvantage doesn't occur. Okay? Really quick, really simple, highlights the winning arguments. Or the second affirmative rebuttal might start with an overview that says, we win 1 primary reason, our case side harms outweigh any of the impact scenarios on the disadvantages that the negative brings to the table. And then you get into the actual line by line of the debate. And that's where you have clash back and forth on each of the individual arguments. If you're going to kick some additional negative positions, which you should, by the way, the 2NR might need to kick an additional disadvantage or an additional counterplan to free up time to really examine the most critical issue in the debate. And then you make sure that on whatever arguments are left, you cover every single 1AR response so that you can show the judge that you win that particular issue in the debate, and ensure that you explain why your arguments and why your responses are beating the responses of the 1AR. Similarly, the 2AR is looking at the responses that the first affirmative rebuttalist made. Remember, the 1AR extended 2 to 4 responses on each of the negative off-case arguments. You're going to reach back and identify the 1 or 2 best responses of the 1AR, or extensions in the 1AR, and highlight why those beat the entire argument given by your opponents, or beat the entire off-case argument. I suppose I should also point out, although it's not on the slide, the 2AR, you absolutely need to make sure that you extend the affirmative case one last time. Make sure that your harm story and solvency story and any additional advantages you have are still relevant and a part of the debate. And then finally, you have the underview. This is where you explain what the round looks like for the judge. What are the different arguments that were presented? Why are those arguments either of primary importance or of less significance? Compare the impacts that you get between the disadvantages or the case side. And essentially, if you're doing your job well, you're writing the judge's ballot. There's a part at the bottom of the ballot where the judge writes the reason for decision. A really good 2NR or really good 2AR will actually spend 30 to 45 seconds writing the ballot for the judge, meaning the last words out of your mouth, the last 30 to 45 seconds of your speech should be what you want the judge to write on the bottom of the ballot. If you're a really good debater, you will write that ballot for your judge. And that goes back to part of the explanation of earlier when I said that the 2AR and the 2NR are the speeches that win most debate rounds. It's because you're A, engaging in that framing of the debate, assigning priorities to arguments, but B, you are spending the time to explain what happened in the debate round, what the critical arguments were, what the critical concessions were, and assigning priorities to those arguments so that the judge knows what to write down on the reason for decision. That then is an explanation and a look at all 8 of the speeches in a policy debate round and what each speaker needs to concern himself or herself with as they prepare for that speech, as they deliver that speech, and so forth. I hope that's really helpful for you, and best of luck.